Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 12th of April, 2016, and today's topic is which microphone to use in which circumstances. So we're going to go ahead and dive right on in. Glad we could do this today. It's 5:30 a.m. here where I'm at. So that's why I'd just like to say that to explain my awesome hair right now. Oh, good. Actually, maybe you can't see it. It's a little crazy in the morning sometimes. There were a couple questions I'd like to address first from our friend Gary Davies. And Gary asked a couple of very interesting questions that I want to talk about here first. And let me just share that screen with you so you can see. This was left over on the Google Plus page if you haven't seen them. Couple of them. First of all, what problems are encountered when you use a shotgun microphone outside with moving sound sources like a car traveling past? That is a very fine question. I have not run into any issues a lot with that in particular, but there are definitely some potential issues with shotgun microphones outdoors. What that's actually, and I think that what you're referring to there, Gary, is a Doppler effect. So the change in frequency of a sound as it moves. There are potential issues there. I think the biggest issue I've run into with that is if there is a car driving past and the microphone position is relatively close to a wall or some other hard surface, and that sound bounces off the surface. That's where the biggest issues occur. And the reason that happens is because, from my understanding, is because of the interference tube design of a shotgun microphone. And let me show you what I mean here. I'm going to stop presenting there, and I'm just going to grab a microphone here real quick. This will do. Yes. Okay. Here we have a Rode NTG 4 Plus. You've all seen this before. This part of the microphone right here is called the interference tube. And same thing on both sides. And the idea is, my understanding is the capsule of the microphone is actually back in this area somewhere inside. And the idea is that the sounds that are coming off axis, so you're aiming this at your sound source right here. And so any sound that's coming from off axis through the interference tube here gets canceled out just because of the laws of physics. However, the trick comes when you're operating in a situation where a single sound source is coming into the front of the microphone and being captured by the capsule. And at the same time, that sound is bouncing off another surface and also coming in the interference tube a few milliseconds later. And that can often, because then what happens is the primary sound that you're trying to capture and that is being captured in the capsule through the front of the microphone is also being partially attenuated or removed when it comes through the interference tube on the side. So you get some funny phasing issues then. And that's really kind of the basics, or the basic reason why a shotgun microphone may not be the best choice when you're recording indoors. And that same thing can actually happen outside. And a good example of that, again, is where you're working outside, you're relatively close to some sort of wall or hard surface. And as that car or truck or whatever drives by, the sound of that vehicle will actually bounce off of the wall and do the same kind of destructive or even constructive kind of effect that you get when there's reverberation indoors. So that's one thing that can happen definitely with a shotgun microphone. And in fact, what I've heard is that a lot of the productions nowadays, I was listening to a sound mixer who works primarily in Atlanta, Georgia, here in the United States. And he indicated something interesting that I wasn't aware of, and that is that a lot of the productions down there nowadays, when they're working outdoors, they're actually using cardioid microphones of various sorts. So one very, very popular one that we actually reviewed on our channel back on YouTube a while back was the Sennheiser MKH50, and they almost always just call those 50s. That's a 50. It's a very popular microphone, and it's used in a lot of productions. And actually, they're using those outdoors. And what they do is they actually put them inside of those wind covers, the big blimps, with the furry cover on top of them, and they're actually using those outdoors quite a bit. They're using Schoeps Colette series microphones outside, again, hypercardioid and supercardioid mics. Actually, both those are supercardioid. So I don't know if the shotgun microphones are falling out of favor amongst the pros, or what's happening there exactly, but that's what I'm hearing, and that's kind of an interesting thing. And I think a lot of it has to do with this particular issue that they're trying to avoid, which is any of those the sort of strange phasing issues that can occur when sound reverberates off of any surface, and that can include outdoors. So, Gary, that's the main thing I know about as far as other things are concerned. I actually did a shoot at one point where we were shooting outside of a home. It's in a fairly rural area, so there was the road that was nearby wasn't right nearby, but there was some truck or lorry traffic going by, and that did bounce off the surface of the house, the walls, and did make some strange things. So that can happen even when you're not indoors. So that's the main thing I know about. So thanks for that question, Gary. And then there is also another question that Gary asked here, and let's just go take a look at that. Second question, even though omnidirectional mics don't reject unwanted sounds well, that is because they pick up sound on all sides or from all directions, are they a better option when interviewing someone you're sharing a mic with, that is, moving it back and forth? And that's another great question. In fact, I've actually heard that question quite a bit. A lot of people, I think, on YouTube now are doing shows where they have either a host and a guest or a couple of different hosts, and they're looking for a way to mic both of those people. I think, Gary, you bring up a very good point here. I think that's a great idea. You're right. It's not going to reject. It's not going to be as directional, so it's not going to reject as much of the ambient sound in the room, in particular, any sort of reverberation coming off the walls. So that's going to be a downside. However, the upside is that you could set the microphone between, say, for example, you have two people talking, you could set it between them, and they could both be picked up by that microphone as long as they're equally distanced and generally talking at the same volume. So that's actually a good idea there that could work. The thing is that you're probably going to want to do something to tame the room that you're in if it isn't already kind of treated or isn't already working well in terms of acoustics. And that's where I think hanging sound blankets behind camera, throwing them on the floor, or anything that's going to be off camera where you can soften the surfaces a little bit and absorb some of that sound before it reflects back and forth throughout the room would be a very helpful strategy. So, Gary, that's a great point. And the reason I think that's a great question as well is that don't always stick by the rules. Think it through. There are cases where certain microphones may be very, very helpful and not traditionally used, but you can actually pull it off. So definitely keep your mind open to other possibilities. And I think that's a great point, Gary. So thanks for that as well. What I wanted to do was kind of walk through some ideas of different things that you could do in different circumstances, or maybe kind of just some thought process you can use for different situations where you need to decide which microphone to use. And I've jotted down a few notes here, and I'm just going to show those here as we talk through them. So let me go ahead and share that really quickly here. Okay. So those of you that have followed for a while, I definitely have a little bit of a bias, and most sound mixers I've talked to do as well, but there are realities as well. So my bias, we're just going to go ahead and put this out up front. I don't love lavalier microphones. They're not my favorite. And the reason for that is that to me, they don't generally sound natural. They sound, especially if you put them on the chest of someone, whoever's going to be wearing it and you're recording. So it often sounds like it's on the chest, so it's gonna have a little bit more of that kind of boomy sound to it often. That's not necessarily a deal killer. So that's one thing. Another thing that, I don't love about lavalier microphones is they have this tendency to pick up lots of things you don't want them to pick up. So clothing noise, um, if the if the talent folds their arms. In fact, I was doing just a bit ago, I was doing a corporate shoot where there was a guest speaker that came to this business, and um, he talked. He was a great speaker. He had very engaging for the audience. But there were a few times throughout that talk where he folded his arms while he was kind of walking around. And you can only imagine what that did with the lavalier microphone. The lav picked all that up, and it was a little bit messy. So that was a little distracting, and it's things like that you can't control as the sound engineer or the mixer. That once you put that mic on the talent, anything can happen. And so that's another reason why it's not my favorite choice. However, of course, being practical, like we all have to be, there's a time and a place. There's no way I could have boomed a mic over this guy that was speaking and make that work. I could have had him do a handheld microphone, a handheld dynamic microphone, but that gets pretty tiring. And he spoke for probably about 35 or 40 minutes. And after 35 or 40 minutes, most people aren't too interested in carrying around a handheld mic. A lot of them, unless they have a lot of microphone experience, don't tend to hold it very well. They don't optimize the position of the mic. So that's another thing where it's a downside. So do I have any regrets having used a lavalier microphone in that circumstance? Absolutely not. I think it was a fine choice. It was probably the best choice. And yeah, there are those moments where he folds his arm and does other things that kind of take the viewer out of the experience because now they know there's a microphone on this guy. But most people are willing to work with that. And another thing to consider too is that lavalier microphones, again, even though I don't like them, there are a lot of productions where lavalier microphones are plain and simply required. The producers want lavalier microphones simply because it can make the whole workflow a lot faster and easier. To be honest, when you're working on a production with other people or even with yourself, even with your own little crew, maybe it's just you and a friend or whatever it may be, um, you have to have someone dedicated to operating a boom mic, and as long as if your talent's moving at all. And that's one less person to do a lot of other stuff that you need to do. So that's another consideration. And frankly, if you're working on a bigger production, nowadays, a lot of gaffers and directors of photography and even producers and even directors get a little annoyed. They don't want to have a boom microphone because sometimes it can mess with the lighting of the scene. So there's that consideration as well. And in fact, in some cases, the way it typically works on a production is that all the gaffers and the electrics and the director of photography will spend however long getting set up for a particular scene to shoot a particular scene. And they have a lot of stuff, and it's in a lot of places. And once they get it set up, they don't like to have to move things once the sound guy shows up, who will typically have a later call time, and get in the way of their lights. Cast shadows with their boom pole or their microphone. So obviously it's a team sport. Everyone has to work together, but there are times when a production will just say, you know what, just use wireless mics or radio mics. We're not going to mess with a boom pole here. And so you may not have a choice. So that's something to consider as well. So the first question I really ask myself is, will a shoot be indoors or outdoors? If it's indoors, I will probably stay away from a shotgun microphone and go with something more like a cardioid if I can. And by cardioid, again, I'm referring to a small diaphragm, super cardioid or hyper cardioid microphone. And again, that's going to be something like in my case, I've got a Rode NT5, I've got an Audio Technica AT4053b, and do I have any others? Those are the two main ones actually that I will rely on. And let me just show you those real quick. Here we go. Okay, so I think we've talked about this one a lot. Here's the Audio Technica 4053b, small diaphragm hypercardioid microphone. That one works well for me. That's actually my go-to mic for so many cases. I use it a ton. And then here is a Rode NT5, just so you can see what those look like if you haven't before. So those for me are kind of my go-tos. Those will be my default choice because again, I'm shooting mainly indoors, and that'll generally work in most circumstances for what I'm doing here. All right. So yeah, one question: will I be working indoors or outdoors? If I'm indoors, going to be small diaphragm condenser with cardioid pickup pattern of some sort, super hypercardioid, one of those two. If I'm outdoors, almost always it will be a shotgun mic, although I'm starting to rethink that. In my case, it will still be a shotgun mic for the time being because I don't have a full blimp cover right now. At some point when I get that, I think I may consider to use some of these cardioid mics outdoors as well. But they're, you know, you have to be careful. They can be very sensitive to handling noise if you're on a hand operated boom pole. A lot of the shotgun mics tend to be, at least the better ones, tend to be designed to manage that handling noise very nicely. Not always the case with a cardioid mic of some sort. So that's a consideration there. Obviously, the next one: will the talent be stationary or will they be moving while they're talking? And also, do I have someone to operate a boom mic or a boom pole? So those are two big questions. If they're going to be moving, if the talent's going to be moving, and I don't have a boom operator, lavaliers are really the only choice. Again, for corporate events, which I end up shooting sometimes, lavaliers are almost always going to work best. And in those cases, I think people are pretty, you know, in those cases, people are pretty willing to live with any of the strangeness that occurs with lavaliers, people folding their arms, rustling their clothes, things of that nature. And, you know, there's definitely a technique. There's a lot of technique actually with the lavalier microphone, getting it positioned correctly and positioned with all the right stuff to prevent as much as possible any of that clothing movement. Also to prevent the talent from jostling it or, you know, anyway, anything that they may end up doing when you're shooting. Now, if the talent are going to be stationary, or if I do have a boom operator available, and sometimes that's me, even as a one-man band, I will sometimes operate a boom pole, then I would definitely go with a shotgun or a cardioid, again, depending on whether I'm indoors or outdoors. So in my case, mostly indoors, so I'm going to be using a cardioid. Again, that Audio Technica 4053b is what I turn to a lot. So just some considerations there. Actually, let me just change this here. Another question is, does the microphone need to be hidden in frame? And I think that's a valid question to consider. If it does need to be hidden in frame, that limits your choices, obviously. If it does need to be, you may want to use not only, you know, obviously a lavalier or a boom mic, but in some cases you can also use a plant mic. And by plant mic, I don't know if what the original intention with that name was, is that you hide it in a plant, or if that means you plant it somewhere in the scene. Either way, the idea with this is a hidden mic that's already somewhere in the scene where the talent's going to be talking. And sometimes that can work really well. And there's a good example of that. Let me just show you here really quickly. I'm going to find, some of you may have heard of a fellow by the name of Ty Ford. Ty Ford is a guy online that he focuses a lot on audio as well. So he does some production sound mixing. And he's got this classic old video that he has online. Let's just look for Ty Ford. Here he is. And he's got a lot of videos here. I'm going to load those up. And this is a super old video that he did that, let me just show it to you really quickly. Okay, it's tiny. It's really low resolution and it's kind of bad quality. This he did in 2008. But let me just share this with you on my screen. Stop that. Sometime go take a peek at this. It's not only it's beautiful music as well. If I make it big here, let's see if you can still see. I don't know if you can still see that. Just make it bigger like that. So this is Ty Ford. He's actually also a musician. Um, Here he is in what looks like just a living room or something, playing a guitar, and it's him talking, and then he plays. And you might ask yourself, how did he mic this? Well, if you look very, very carefully, right here, he has a microphone just resting on the arm of this couch or love seat or whatever it is, right there. It's a small diaphragm condenser microphone. Specifically, it is a Schoeps Colette CMC641. So that's how he did the miking there. And that is a perfect example of a plant mic where it's actually in the scene, but it's not something that the viewer will typically see. You have to have a very sharp eye to see that. And that's a great example of using a plant mic. So definitely something to consider. Um, and by the way, when you hear that, I would highly recommend you go look at that piece because when you hear that, it's like, wow. Now, obviously, he added some effects afterwards. So I think he actually recorded it there, but he also did some post processing on that audio. You'll definitely hear it. Sounds like he's in a beautiful concert hall, and it is one of the most impressive audio recordings I've heard in a living room like that. So definitely worth checking out. And a great example, as I say, of a plant mic. All right. So that's something you can consider. And plant mics can be a variety of different types of mics. I think if you're doing stuff indoors, plant mics are often going to be a small diaphragm condenser microphone like that. Or they can also be lavalier microphones. And in fact, lavalier microphones are often used as plant mics in cars. If you're going to shoot a car scene, a lot of times what they'll do is they will plant a lavalier microphone up on the visor if you're trying to capture, someone in the front seat. And in the back seat, they will often put it on the back of the seat or the headrest of the seat in front of them so that you can capture the dialogue of the person sitting in the back seat. So definitely some things to consider and to get some practice with if you find yourself in that situation. Now, in some cases, for maybe a talk show, it will be okay to have a microphone in the frame as well. And in those cases, I think you're better off with a microphone that you might use for voiceover, for example. So if you are doing a show where you have several talent and they're each going to be sitting at a table talking and you have the budget for multiple microphones, something like this may be a good choice. Let me just lift this up as carefully as I can. This is the Electrovoice RE20. You may have seen this microphone before, but this is one that I use a lot for voiceover work. So if I'm going to be, if I'm doing a tutorial online or a kind of a screencast tutorial, I'll use this microphone. The nice thing about this microphone, it is not a condenser microphone. It is a dynamic microphone. So it doesn't need power of any sort, does not need phantom power. And it's not nearly as sensitive as a condenser microphone would be. But that's also to your advantage in these particular cases, in a lot of cases, because if you're working indoors and you're in a reverberant room, this will not pick up a lot of that reverb. So it's a real advantage in that case. So definitely something worth considering as well. And again, if you're doing a talk show, it can be perfectly normal. And in fact, in some cases, they add microphones just for stylistic purposes. So you see some of the late night shows, and they've almost always got a microphone of some sort on the desk. Frankly, they're not using it. It's just for looks. But you can also include it in the frame and actually use it. So that's a consideration as well. And obviously, if it's just a voiceover job that you're doing, it doesn't matter much what the microphone looks like because that's not going to be seen. That's just going to have some narration over some other footage. And you can have your talent use whichever mic they need or you want to use, and that suits their voice. However, one consideration in that case is if you're going to cut that narration with another microphone and you don't want it to be too jarring, you may want to make a different choice about what you use for the voiceover work. So this microphone here, again, the Electrovoice RE20, may or may not be a good choice if you're going to be cutting with another mic that sounds very, very different, or maybe that's okay too. It depends on the piece where if you want this sort of voice of God kind of sound for the narration and you want the actors on screen to sound very different, that's okay too. So just some things to kind of think through as you're making a microphone choice. All right, let's switch back to our document here and see if there's anything else we wanted to cover here in today's session. Another thing too, if you're going to be shooting, and in fact, this will be something relevant for me, hopefully, this next week. I will actually be going to the National Association of Broadcasters earlier next week. And one of my friends, Scott Vanderbilt, and I will be doing some reporting from the show floor and potentially interviewing some sound mixers as well. So, in the cases where we'll be on the show floor, that's where I would probably just use a dynamic microphone. So, potentially, we may use lavaliers. I'm not sure yet, but here is a classic that you've all seen before. You could use something like this. Actually, here's one you could use. This is not the one I intended, but we'll show you this. You could use a Shure SM57. This is actually an instrument mic, but it's a dynamic mic, so it's going to be better at rejecting a lot of the noise and not picking up the stuff you do not want to pick up when you're in a noisy situation. But the classic vocal dynamic mic is its sibling, the Shure SM58. And almost everyone's seen that one before. So one of these will probably maybe work with if we're going to use with dynamic microphones. Of course, then you have to hold it. Not a big deal if you're doing a short interview like that on a show floor, but something worth considering. So there are some thoughts I just wanted to throw out to you in regards to microphone choice and typically how I work. But I think Gary asked some great questions that we covered earlier on. Keep your mind open. You might use something that might not first strike you as the right choice, but actually could end up working out really, really well. So keep that possibility open, and you could end up learning something new and finding a new technique that's going to work for future cases as well. Thanks for tuning in for today's episode. And if you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below at the Google Plus page. If you're in the course and you have my email address, you're welcome to email me anytime. I'd love to hear from you and address any questions that you have or ideas that you have, or just talk. And we will talk to you all again next week. Take care, everybody.